Perfect. Sweet. Well, I'll jump right into it. So, yeah, thank you for that introduction, Winifred. So, yeah, my name is Harrison Lee, for those who don't know me, and today I'm going to be talking to you about presenting your best evidence first and intervention to assist jurors in their evaluation of victims' testimony in cases of rape. And before I begin, first off, a big thank you to my supervisors, Blake, Barbara, and Jason, who without their tremendous work which went into this project, it just wouldn't have happened, as well as Lachlan Brown, who is an undergraduate student, and he was awesome in helping me with the content analysis in study 2. So first, rape is legally defined as a crime that occurs when a perpetrator penetrates another person without that person's consent. Now, consent is legally defined as permission freely and voluntarily given by a person with the cognitive capacity to give that consent. Now, rape can be perpetrated by both men and women against both men and women, but since the vast majority of cases are when a man rapes a woman, this research will be focusing on that gender dynamic. Now, the latest statistics show the rate of conviction, or the chance the jury will find the defendant guilty of rape for these cases, can be as low as 33% in Australia. And now when you compare that conviction rate to all the other crimes in Australia, you can see that it is disproportionately low. As such, my research focuses on the barriers to conviction in these cases and what we can do to mitigate these barriers. And to answer that question, the first question we need to ask is, how do jurors make decisions? Well, the most empirically supported theoretical model of jury decision-making is the cognitive story model by Pennington and Hastie. And in this model, it is theorized that jurors construct a story of what happened in the alleged crime in order to reach a verdict for the defendant. In creating these stories, jurors rely on the evidence that is presented at trial, as well as their general knowledge or schemas about the crime itself. Also, jurors will be likely to construct a story that makes the most coherent sense to them. A way to present information in a trial that makes a particular story more coherent to the jury is to present the evidence in a chronological order. But other research suggests that jurors will be more likely to construct a story which matches a guilty verdict when the evidence is consistent with their schemas about the alleged crime. So what is a schema? Well, a schema is a pre-existing assumption about the way the world is organized. It is a structure of knowledge which people use to simplify information quickly and effortlessly. And people are most likely to use schemas when they're in a situation where they need to understand or evaluate ambiguous and complex information, such as in a rape trial. So a juror may use a schema to help them evaluate evidence presented in trial when the schema is consistent with the information they first observe. So with that reasoning, what schemas are jurors likely to use to evaluate the victim's testimony in cases of alleged rape? Well, if the victim says in her testimony that she was attacked by a stranger, that the rape occurred outside, that the perpetrator used physical violence in the attack, and that she physically resisted, it is likely that the juror will use or activate their rape schema to evaluate her testimony. And this is because this information is consistent with what most people expect to occur in a typical rape. What this means is that the juror is most likely to decide that the victim was raped by the defendant. But this information is different to what most rape victims will describe in their testimony. In most rape trials, the victim will be likely to say that she was attacked by someone she knew, that the rape occurred indoors, that the perpetrator did not use physical violence, and that she did not physically resist the assault. And so since this information is inconsistent with what the jurors expect to say, what jurors expect to occur in a rape case, they may not be able to use their rape schema to evaluate this information. So what schema are jurors going to use to understand the victim's testimony in most cases of rape? Well, what is expected to occur in consensual sex or heterosexual couples may actually be more consistent with what actually happens in most rape cases. This is because the consensual sex groups are based on traditional gender roles, where the man is expected to initiate all sexual behavior, while the woman is expected to object to the man's advances before eventually consenting to sex. As such, it is believed that what the victim testifies about in most cases of rape is more likely to match jurors' schemas about consensual sex than their schemas about rape. Research investigating how mock jurors evaluate the victim's testimony supports this theory. This research shows that if participants are presented with a case which matches their expectations of what occurs in a stereotypical rape, they'll be more likely to find the defendant guilty. But if participants are presented with a common rape case, they'll be less likely to find the defendant guilty and be more likely to blame the victim for the situation, even though the actual beliefs of the victim's verbal non-consent do not change, or the actual details of non-consent, moreover. And a study by Little and colleagues also found that when participants are primed with cues from a consensual sex script and are then presented with an acquaintance rape case, they'll be likely to judge that the case is actually a seduction and a rape did not occur. This research presents a problem as it shows that regardless of the victim's consent, juries will be likely to decide on a verdict based on whether the case is consistent with a real rape script or a consensual sex script. What is even more problematic is that the prosecution's counsel will most likely present the victim's testimony in a chronological order so that the events she describes are more coherent to the jury. This means that in a common rape case, the victim will first introduce cues to a consensual sex script rather than a real rape script. This means that jurors may activate the consensual sex schema and evaluate this testimony using this schema rather than a rape schema. As such, they'll be more likely to construct a story where the victim consented to have sex with the defendant and so find the defendant not guilty. However, if you were to present the rape event first in the testimony, followed by the other events in chronological order, then you'll be presenting information that is more consistent with jurors' rape schema at the start of the victim's testimony. This may then allow jurors to activate their rape schema and so evaluate the information in this testimony as being consistent with the schema. As such, they may then decide that the victim was raped and so find the defendant not guilty. So this brings us to our first study. And in study 1, we aim to test whether changing the order in which the victim's testimony is presented can influence how mock jurors evaluate the events she describes. Aligned with the theory I just described, our overall prediction was that participants who watched the rape first version of the testimony would categorize the events described over the duration of this testimony as being more consistent with rape than those who watched the chronological testimony. Since we predicted that participants who watched this version of the testimony would categorize it as depicting rape, we also predicted they'd be more likely to find the defendant guilty than those who watched the chronological testimony. In order to investigate this research question, we assessed how participants evaluated this testimony in real time. Specifically, participants used a slider to evaluate whether the events described in the victim's testimony depicted rape or consensual sex. The position of the slider was recorded for every second of the video of this testimony. Participants were asked to move this slider anytime the video led them to update their judgment, as shown on the screen here. Participants' ratings on this slider were averaged for every 10 seconds of video to form the within subjects variable time of video. After watching the video of the victim's testimony, participants were then asked to indicate the likelihood that the defendant was guilty of rape. Now, the sample for study 1 were 217 undergraduate students from UQ, so it was predominantly a female sample, and the sample was also quite young in age. Now, so just for a quick breakdown of what occurred in each testimony in the study, the victim's testimony in the study depicted what frequently occurs in most rape cases. So the victim went to a bar with a few friends before meeting the defendant who she previously knew. After flirting and dancing at the bar, the defendant ended up tricking her so that she would go back to his place, where they eventually started kissing before he then raped her. So, as you can see, the same events were described in each testimony, with the only thing changing is the order of which they were presented in. So now to the results of the study. And so we found that, contrary to predictions, the effective testimony order was not constant over the duration of the video and changed depending on the events the victim described. So for the rape first condition, participants initially categorized the rape event as rape. They then continued to evaluate the victim's testimony as being consistent with rape, until she described how she and the defendant kissed before the alleged assault. Participants in this condition then evaluated these events as being depictive of consensual sex. On the other hand, participants in the chronological testimony changed in how they evaluated the victim's testimony as both rape and consensual sex, depending on the events being described. But they still, on average, evaluated the alleged assault as being consistent with rape. Therefore, there was no significant differences between both conditions by the end of the testimony. There was also no differences in the participants' likelihood of finding the defendant guilty on the basis of the order the testimony was presented. Due to the lack of support for our hypotheses, we decided to explore more closely how participants categorized the actions described over the details of the alleged rape, to see if there was any real differences in how participants evaluated this critical information. And we found that participants who were presented with the rape event first categorized the actions described over this event as more consistent with rape than those who watched the chronological testimony. This finding is consistent with the reasoning that participants activated their rape schema to a greater extent when they were first presented with the details consistent with this schema. But there is an alternative explanation for this finding. The details of the alleged rape in the study were not overly consistent with the real rape script. The victim did not physically resist, and the defendant did not use an extreme amount of force in his assault. In that case, participants may not have been able to perceive these details as being consistent with their rape schema. It is also unlikely that these participants activated their consensual sex schema, considering they on average categorized this event as being consistent with rape. If they couldn't use the schema then, how did participants evaluate the rape event? Well, according to the encoding flexibility model, when perceivers are not able to activate a schema from the information presented to them, they'll evaluate the information based on its specific details. In contrast, perceivers only remember the gist of the information that is consistent with their schemas. So if introducing the rape event first and the victim's testimony is unable to activate a rape schema, it may force jurors to evaluate the information based on the specific details. These competing explanations were investigated in study 2 by assessing participants' memories of the details of the events described in the victim's testimony. In study 1, we also looked at the scatterplot data from the study, and we got the impression that individual participants changed between categorizing the events described as rape and consensual sex to a greater extent when they watched the rape first version of the testimony. To test this more rigorously, we calculated each participant's standard deviation for their responses on the event categorization measure. An independent group's t-test then showed that participants who watched the rape first version of the testimony had larger standard deviations on this measure than those who watched the chronological testimony. So what explains this unexpected finding? Well, research suggests that when you present evidence in a chronological order, it assists the jury to organize this evidence into a story of what happened in the alleged crime. In that case, participants who watched the chronological testimony in the current study may have converged in their responses to whether the events described were rape or consensual sex because it follows a coherent story. But when the testimony was presented with the natural end of the story, that is, the details of the alleged rape at its beginning, participants may have found it more difficult to organize the events described into a coherent story of either rape or consensual sex. And so in that case, they may have varied between these two categories while watching the victim testify. This explanation was tested more rigorously in study 2 by asking participants to write out loud their thoughts when deciding a verdict for the defendant. These written narratives were then analysed using a content analysis used by Pennington and Hastie in their earlier work to test the extent to which participants organised the information described in the testimony as a story. So this takes us to our second study. And apart from what I just described before, the main aim of study 2 was to see if the effects of testimony order found in study 1 would replicate after strengthening the manipulation of it. To do this, we presented the rape event more clearly to participants when it was introduced at the start of the victim's testimony. So study 2 was a very similar design to study 1, with just the extra event memory and written narrative measures to follow up those unexpected results found in study 1, which I discussed earlier. Also for the study, we recruited community members from Prolific so that the sample was more representative of the characteristics of jurors. Sorry, issue there. Okay, we're good now. Even though we strengthened the manipulation of study 2, in study 2, the results replicated fairly consistently from study 1. Participants who watched the rape first version of the testimony started categorizing the events described as rape. But then this changed when the victim described events associated with the consensual sex scripts. Participants in this condition evaluate these events as being consistent with consensual sex. And in contrast, participants in the chronological condition started to view the victim's testimony as consensual sex until she described the alleged rape. They then, on average, evaluated this event as being consistent with rape. And just like in study 1, there was also no differences in the likelihood of participants finding the defendant guilty. But notably, as found in study 1, participants in the rape first condition evaluated the alleged assault as being more consistent with rape than those who watched the chronological testimony. But why did participants in this condition do this? Did they encode the details of this event, or did they activate their rape schema? Well, the results from the event memory measure showed that participants who watched the rape first version of the testimony remembered less details than those who watched the chronological testimony. In that case, participants who were presented with the rape event first in the victim's testimony may have been more likely to evaluate this event using their rape schema. And this is because they remembered less details of this information and so may have only encoded the gist that is consistent with their schemas. I'm going to skip over the nitty-gritty of the content analysis, as this analysis suggested that, contrary to predictions, participants in both testimonial conditions were able to organise the events described into a story when they were asked to write out loud their thoughts when deciding a verdict. So this finding suggests that jurors may still be able to construct a story of what happened in the alleged rape, even when the victim's testimony is presented in a non-chronological order. However, in the original study, Pennington and Hastie did not assess how difficult it was for mock jurors to construct a story, only if they did or did not. And so in that case, we investigated how long it took participants to construct their stories in the current study. And after controlling for the lengths of their written narratives, we found that participants who watched the rape first version of the testimony took significantly longer to answer the written narrative measure, suggesting that they may have found it more difficult to organise the events described in the victim's testimony into a story, compared to those who watched the chronological testimony. So to try and tie all of this in together, we found consistent support that presenting the strongest evidence early in the victim's testimony may cause jurors to initially evaluate this evidence as being consistent with rape. But this evaluation changes when the victim describes behaviours which are associated with the consensual sex scripts. So this intervention may not be completely effective in changing the way jurors evaluate the victim's testimony. Also, it may disrupt jurors' abilities to organise the events the victim describes into a coherent story of what occurred in the alleged crime. So a lot of future research is still needed. Specifically, we're currently collecting data for studies investigating how changing the order in which the victim's testimony is presented influences the stories jurors are able to construct, and whether these stories are more persuasive or less persuasive in the context of deliberation. We also eventually have plans to test whether this intervention can be used in conjunction with other trial procedures in order to have better outcomes on how jurors evaluate the evidence presented in rape trials. Thank you.